Chapter 22. Mother, Dad, Ford Agency, Childhood. It may seem odd that I have written 163 pages of rambling descriptions about people and events, and only a few short paragraphs about my own mother. A person so important in my life and in the lives of everyone who might have been privileged to know her. Let me try now to pick out a few of the highlights and proper words to describe a wonderful person. Born on November 20th, 1882, and the last in the family of 10, it seems odd that her parents could still find 3 names they liked, when all the rest received only 2. She was christened Georgina Alma-Dean Stewart. Unfortunately, both her parents died while she was very young, which made it necessary for her sister Etta Reichman of Hamilton to care for her during her school years. Instantly, Etta's son, John, about the same age as mother, became head of the water department in the city of Chicago. John was much more of a brother than a nephew. He married Lena and had one daughter, Catherine, who married Elliot Johnson and became the head of a large law firm in Houston, Texas. It so happened that my father, Fred DeWitt, was friendly with George and Ellen Aunt Nell Stewart of Fruitland. When Dad was invited to their place for dinner to meet Mother, he accepted reluctantly, not realizing that there was 20 years difference in ages of the 2 sisters. Apparently, it was love at first sight, and he practically burned up the road between his home in Tapleytown and Fruitland with a horse and buggy. In 1902, grandfather, Charlie DeWitt, bought this farm and promptly moved into this rather spacious house compared to the small cottage in Tapleytown. The trips to Fruitland were a lot shorter, only a half-mile, and probably a lot more often. The wedding date was set for July the 6th, 1903, and grandfather bought, or made arrangements to buy, the small 6-room stucco house directly across DeWitt Road on No. 8 Highway. 7.5 acres of land with almost 300 feet frontage on No. 8. I have no idea what he paid, but when you consider that the price for this 34.5 acres with a large 4-year-old brick house, plus a 40-foot by 60-foot frame barn, plus a smaller 6-room house for the farm help, plus 10 acres of full-grown apple trees and 9 acres of vineland was less than $5,000, then you will know that anything over $1,000 would be too much. Whatever the price, it was a greatly appreciated wedding gift. An interesting sidelight, the Cataract Power Company of Niagara Falls decided to build a new high-voltage power line to Hamilton, and with probably 1,000 other choices of route, they actually bought a 100-foot wide strip of land running diagonally across this property. It divided the farm into 2 parts, which were almost equal in area, and as a compensation for this, my grandfather received $3,000 in 1903, only 3 years after buying the property. If he knew about this, then it was an excellent plan and good business, but I am more inclined to believe that it was straight luck. There are no records to consult, so I'll have to assume that it was one of these years, either before or shortly after the wedding, that Dad went out west to reassemble and sell Massey Harris binders, a machine pulled by horses or tractors that would not only cut the standing wheat, oats, barley, etc., but would also tie it up in neat little 3 or 4 pound bundles, which could be stacked in groups of 8 or 10, heads up and left to dry. Winnipeg was practically a frontier town at this date, and in spite of being exceptionally busy, Dad was as homesick as one could be. He took smallpox, a disease that nearly cost him his life. Hospital facilities were practically non-existent, no serum or known cure, and the treatment consisted of total isolation in what was called a pest house, built some distance from all other buildings. I have heard it said that grandfather knew a full day in advance of the telegram that brought the sad news home. Who knows how? Dad returned home as soon as he was well enough and was quite happy to remain in Ontario for the rest of his short life, with the exception of one pleasure trip to the West Coast and once or twice to Florida. My sister Beatrice was their firstborn, in 1908, and Mabel arrived 2 years later. Unfortunately, Mabel was not a robust baby, and in spite of all the care in the world, Mother could not find a food that would agree with her digestive system. Her health went steadily downhill, and she finally died in 1911. As if this was not enough trouble, Beatrice was caught in the polio epidemic of 1912, which left her with one crippled leg. Again, this was a comparatively new disease, and the treatment was barbaric. Mother told me in later years that she would never again put a child through the painful torture of what was called treatment, regardless of the consequences. In spite of her disability, I can remember Beatrice as a plump, round-faced, happy little girl who seemed to enjoy life as it came. She died in 1920 of what seemed to be a relapse of the same disease. On the night of January 29, 1915, my father marched anxiously up and down No. 8 Highway, then a stone-covered dirt road, kerosene lantern in hand, in anticipation of the arrival of Dr. Alway, who was coming by horse and buggy from Bartonville, then a small community in the vicinity of Parkdale Avenue and King Street in Hamilton. It was my turn to come into the world, and no doubt Dad was hoping desperately that the doctor would arrive before me. In any case, he was not willing to chance that the good doctor might go on past DeWitt Road in the darkness of the night. Things must have worked out right, because I was off to a good start sometime before midnight. For Mother, the trouble she had experienced with Mabel began all over again with me. Her own breast milk would not agree with me, nor would anything else that she tried. She must have tried many diets before someone suggested goat's milk, and, this being a do-it-yourself world, the only thing to do was buy a goat. You would have to know Mother to realize what kind of problems this presented. She never had much confidence in the good behavior of any animal, terrified of horses and cows, and had probably never looked after any kind of pet, and, besides this, a goat does not smell too good. The worries of, how do you milk it? Where do you tether it? How does it eat? Etc., were all solved in due course when it was determined that the milk was the proper food for me. It was not too long before our goat would patiently stand on top of the 2-foot-high box without any coaxing, well in advance of milking time. I am told that Mother took over all the duties of a goat herder without the least consideration of her own likes or dislikes. The goat received most of the credit for saving my life, but I am content to believe that Mother contributed generously towards the work required, the inconveniences of tending an animal regularly, and most importantly, lots of extra love for a weakling baby, myself. As I mentioned way back at the beginning, it was 1912 when Dad started to be a Ford dealer, and only 2 years later he built a new building on No. 8 Highway. An impressive building, and certainly a large one for this area, 2-story, cement block and flat roof, 60-foot frontage on No. 8, and at least 100 feet deep. There were store-type windows for display across the front, and a drive-in door in the middle on the main floor. There were evenly spaced, large-sized windows completely around the building on both upper and lower floors, with an exit door directly opposite the front door. The second floor was rather open, except for the 1-foot square roof supports that seemed to be everywhere but, of course, were symmetrically located for maximum strength. What was more interesting was the little hill that was built on the west side about 10 or 12 feet from the building, and the wooden bridge from the peak of the hill to the upper floor. Although the grade was kept rather uniform from No. 8 or from the back door to the upper floor, it was rather a formidable hill to climb, especially with a Model T. There was little space to spare, and when you make that swing to cross the bridge, you better be right the first time. This was the pioneer days of the automobile, and consequently, from a mechanical standpoint, things were really primitive. For instance, the main bearings, 3, and the connecting rods, 4, were poured with a molten material called Babbitt, which was similar to ordinary lead, but somewhat harder. These bearings were quite durable and would survive considerable abuse, but would give up if the motor was run short of lubricating oil or coolant, usually water. Well, DeWitt's garage was equipped to re-pour these bearings, and what was more unusual, to run the motor in before it was completely assembled to install in the car. The procedure was rather simple. The block, complete with the pistons and newly poured bearings, was bolted securely in line with the powerful drive, which would be stopped or started by means of a hand-controlled clutch. The operator stood with large oil can in hand, frequently squirting each bearing as it sizzled and smoked. The trick was to know how many turns would run it in rather than burn it out. It took several hours to do the job properly because of the many stops to allow for cooling, but when finally completed, it would easily be a better motor than it was originally. It's worth the time to describe the large 1-cylinder kerosene motor that was used to power the line shaft, which drove all their power tools. To begin with, this engine was entirely too large to be part of the main floor, so a small 20-foot square frame room was built on the southeast corner. The twin flywheels were at least 5 feet in diameter, made of cast iron, and weighed several hundred pounds apiece. The single piston, which ran horizontally, was 7 inches in diameter or more, and looked like a 1-gallon paint pail rushing back and forth in the cylinder. This was a very slow-speed engine, and as it was built wide open, one could watch every part as it performed its duty. The exhaust pipe, about 4-inch steel tubing, merely poked through a small hole in the south wall. Being kerosene, the explosions were not sharp, but rather a boom, as you would expect to hear from a distant canyon. The twin flyball governor maintained a constant speed by merely cutting off the ignition for a boom or two until it settled down to the proper speed again. So it turned out that everyone within a quarter mile could easily tell how hard that old engine was working by listening for the number of evenly spaced consecutive booms. I have no idea about the amount of horsepower developed, but once those mammoth flywheels were turning at about 450 revolutions per minute, it took a lot of work to stop it. It was during the first few years of Ford sales that Dad decided to sponsor an English immigrant, Mr. James Kay. Mr. Joseph Whitfield Sr. came at the same time, and I am not sure if Dad sponsored him also. Mr. Kay had left his wife and daughter in England to arrive here with little or nothing, and was invited to have a room and board in our own home, at least temporarily. He turned out to be Dad's right-hand man for the rest of Dad's short life, a fine gentleman and a true friend. He and Model T cars and tractors went together like a hand in a glove, and it was not too long before his reputation as a mechanic covered most of the Niagara Peninsula. Even Ford themselves consulted him on special problems. On one occasion, Mr. Harry Bigger, who lived near the lake on Glover's Road, had a fire that started without warning in his home. There was no firefighting equipment in the entire area, with the exception of a few sulfuric acid soda 3-gallon hand extinguishers at DeWitt's garage. The excited phone call put Jim Kay on the road in record time in the little Model T pickup truck. He did everything right except secure the extinguisher in an upright position. I don't know at what point of the rough 3-mile trip the thing upset, but when he arrived at the scene of the fire, the entire box of the pickup was full of white foam, and of course the extinguisher was empty. Obviously, Mr. Kay was too busy driving at top speed to have time to glance backwards, and there is no doubt that he provided the subject for many jokes. Somehow, they got the fire out in spite of everything, because the house is still standing. What I'm trying to say is, I just do not know whether these first 15 or more years of married life were happy times for Mother, or just a series of trials, one to follow another. In any case, I cannot recall any bitter complaints or regrets being mentioned by her. She was forever too busy to allow problems to hold her back. For instance, Grandmother mentioned one day that she would like to have the small upstairs room, now our bathroom, pampered. The next time the old folks went to town for the day, Mother did the job all by herself. She had picked a paper that was generously sprinkled with yellow roses, and when Grandmother saw them, she was pretty quick to point out that she much preferred pink roses. Grandmother was never easily pleased, and it made no difference how much effort was involved in trying. The very next day the folks were away, Mother painted every one of the hundreds of yellow roses a nice bright pink. I never heard whether this was really satisfactory or not. At least it must have been a surprise. With no kindergarten at Fruitland School, my school days began when I was 7 years old, and from this point on I can remember at least part of what happened. It was 1922, and I was therefore the only child left in the DeWitt family, and certainly overprotected. Most days I was driven the mile to school by car, Model T, by anyone from the garage who was available. Occasionally it was left to Mother to drive, and that was a rare experience. She had to be the most cautious and nervous driver in Canada, and I am sure that the only reason she would attempt the trip was because there were hardly any other cars on the road. It took nearly as long as the same trip on foot, because we always went north on DeWitt Road to Barton Street, then east to Fruitland Road, where the traffic was considerably less. It took Mother extra time to drive onto the shoulder of the road and stop to allow each of the approaching cars safely by before she would continue. I mean those cars going in the opposite direction. These must have been her learning years, because in later years she drove new cars in the cavalcade from Toronto with 7 or 8 other drivers, who probably went to Toronto by train to bring home another batch of new vehicles. Just in case you are one of those who have never driven a Model T, this is how it goes. Firstly, the wheels are 30 inches in diameter with 3.5-inch rubber tires pumped up to a solid 50 pounds pressure to make sure that you will feel every stone or hole in the road. The steering wheel, about 16 inches in diameter, is geared so directly with the front wheels that the slightest turn will alter your course by 45 degrees with hardly any effort. Built this way purposely to help you duck and dodge at least some of those holes. It turns out that you do not really steer as you would a modern car, but rather guide it as closely as possible in the direction you wish to go. Protruding from the steering column, both right and left, are two 8-inch levers within finger reach of the steering wheel, because you better not let go completely. The one on the right is the throttle, down is faster. The one on the left is the ignition advance, used mostly when starting the motor, up to start, down to run. The 3 pedals which stick up through the floorboards, intended for use with both feet, are attached to the planetary transmission and give the driver control of forward and backward motion, plus braking all in one fell swoop. The 2-foot-long hand lever positioned on the left side of the driver's legs vertically is the parking brake, which allows the driver to let the motor run until the car is parked. So, let's go for a ride. Ignition switch on, throttle about quarter speed, ignition advance fully retarded, and parking brake fully applied. You may now get out of the car and walk around to the front. Take a firm hold on the crank which protrudes forward at the center bottom of the radiator and turn clockwise until the motor is running, hopefully within the first 5 minutes. Return to the driver's seat, advance ignition control lever, and adjust throttle to desired motor speed. The left foot lever is in the low and high gear for forward travel, and also when held halfway down, it is in the neutral position to allow the car to remain stationary. The parking brake hand lever is linked to this clutch pedal, and when fully applied, holds it in a neutral position, so as you hold it in its present position, you may release the parking brake and you are ready to go. Depress the clutch pedal as you feed it more throttle. You are now in low gear, and hold until you have reached a reasonable speed, about 10 miles per hour, at which time you may fully release clutch pedal, you are now in high gear, and adjust throttle to desired speed. Really nothing to it. The big job is to hold it on the road. When you wish to stop, depress the clutch to its neutral position and apply pressure to the right foot lever, which is your service brake. Just remember that only the rear wheels do the braking, and if one of those happens to be on ice, neither will work. The only essential driving instructions remaining are those for reversing. Simply hold the clutch pedal in its neutral position, and with the right foot apply pressure to the center foot pedal. You are now going backwards at exactly the same speed as low gear would propel the car forward, in most cases entirely too fast. My driving instructions may sound rather complicated at first glance, but I can assure you that most people found driving a Model T as easy and natural as eating with a fork. In fact, many soon began to feel that they were part of the car. Everyone has poked fun at the Model T since its beginning, because of simple design, lightweight, and cheap price, but not any of those people would ever consider driving their present modern car over those tortuous roads, cow pastures, mud holes, and streams that were included in the everyday travel of a Model T. Even that oddball planetary transmission is a forerunner of today's automatic transmission, different only in the fact that gears are now changed automatically by means of hydraulic pressure. Little wonder then that Ford is credited with putting the nation on wheels. I am almost ashamed to look back at my behavior as a child. I got away with everything except murder. Those mischievous things for which I should have been severely walloped ended up in a feeble attempt at hand-strapping. I can hear Mother say as harshly as she was able, "You know you shouldn't have done that. Now hold your hand and hold it steady." Then, as the strap descended, I would move my hand right or left a few inches and watch it go harmlessly by. 2 or 3 more weak attempts with the same result would generally bring a few subdued chuckles, and I knew the danger was past. Dr. Smith at Grimsby was our family doctor and quite the one for hypodermic injections, and on this instance I was the target. I put up the usual fuss, but I knew I would get it anyway, as I ended up face down across his lap. In a bid for sympathy, I made an exaggerated flinch as the needle entered my hip, which resulted in it breaking off before the doctor could withdraw it. About an inch of the needle remained in there, a matter of small consequence to anyone, even me. However, I milked that experience for every ounce of sympathy it was worth, and used every opportunity to simply exclaim, "Oh, my needle," and thereby escape another deserved punishment. I'm willing to bet that mother was as willing to use this excuse for a no-punishment program as I was. The needle was finally removed at the same time as my appendix when I was 17 years old. I had the mumps when I was 8 years old, and to relieve the monotony of convalescence, Dad bought me a BB gun. They did not entirely agree that I should be allowed a dangerous weapon at such an early age, but nevertheless, Mother allowed me to set up a firing range in the dining room, and before the shut-in time had passed, I had learned to consistently hit a small penny. By the next summer, I was a proud owner of a .22 rifle, and again, it must have been a great worry for Mother. At the tender age of 9 years old, Dad permitted me the use of a second-hand Model T, so long as I remained on the farm, and you can bet I made a lot of unnecessary trips to the furthest point from the barn. It was about this time that the Model T farm tractors were beginning to become popular. Dad must have had them sent by rail to Stony Creek or Winona Station, and how we got them home from there I will never know. I do remember the lineup of 15 or 16 new gray and red tractors waiting for the startup day. Each one required 10 gallons of water for the cooling system, plus a couple more for the air cleaning system, leading to the carburetor intake. 2 gallons of oil for the crankcase, 3 for the transmission, and 2 more for the rear end differential. This is the easy part. Everything about them was set up so tight at the factory with no lubrication at all that the best man in the group was not strong enough to turn anything by himself. So this is the way to do it. Attach 10 or 12 feet of good sturdy rope to the starting crank, and have 4 men take a firm grip and prepare to pull it in unison. A 5th man to engage the crank and its ratchet, and keep the other 4 in rhythmic 2-foot pulls, as he engages the crank after each pull. The 6th man, usually Jim K., manipulates the controls and incidentally takes all the abuse when it refuses to start. Once running, don't dare shut it off for at least an hour. It could be even tougher the second time. There are no mufflers on this model, so by the time they are halfway down the line, the roar is very similar to a squadron of B-29s waiting to take off. Floats or delivery trailers were as yet unheard of, so the only way to get from their final destination was to drive them, regardless of distance. Try to imagine driving almost 3 tons of cast iron and steel on miles of gravel or dirt road. No muffler, no brakes, no fenders, on all steel wheels with 2-inch high cleats, and the only spring between you and that rough road is under the seat, a flat piece of 2-inch wide spring steel about 16 inches long. It was during the early 20s that Mother suffered through an operation that is today called a hysterectomy. It not only came close to claiming her life, but it also left her a lifetime of problems of chronic constipation, due mostly to the lack of knowledge and experience of all surgeons of that era. This was a hush-hush type of problem and consequently never openly discussed, especially by my mother. I do not know when Dad's drinking problem began, or if he had any excuse to start, or perhaps he just drifted into a problem that he could not have possibly anticipated. How does one know whether his system is one that will demand more and more, or one that will flatly reject the intrusion of alcohol? He often had difficulty making it around the corner of DeWitt and No. 8, and sometimes used up all the road to get into our backyard, blurry-eyed and staggering walk and almost speechless, but never sick. 1 hour of sound sleep and he was ready to begin again, and usually did. Times were good and business boomed and the money rolled in at a terrific rate. They picked out the plans to build a new home and made the first step towards the project by hauling the sand and gravel for the concrete. It must have been discouraging for Mother to watch each rainstorm slowly dwindle the bile away with her dreams of a new home. It was never used. Dad's last year was nothing less than hell on earth. His mind was clear and active, but cirrhosis had completely taken over his life, and even while in the hospital he was allowed rations of liquor just to maintain his sanity. He knew his time was short, and he also knew he had caused his own problem with no possibility of any help, a pathetic situation. Too late are really sad words. He died in November of 1927. Being widowed at the beginning of a worldwide depression was a double blow for Mother, and it must have been pretty tough to drop from a rather affluent lifestyle and no financial responsibilities to stretching every penny to its limit, not poverty, but very close. It made little difference to her attitude of making the best of a bad situation. Actually, when the initial shock wore off a bit, and everyone generally accepted hard times, each found his way to get as much pleasure out of living, but in an entirely different manner. Our home was the focal point of the Stewart family, and as we had no transportation, most of the parties and card games were held here, with as much laughter and hullabaloo as one could handle. 1928 was the only year Mother actually ran the farm by herself, and this was enough to demonstrate that it was not her line of work. Contrary to the advice of our very honest and clever lawyer, Joseph Sweet, Mother chose to pay Dad's debts to almost the full extent of the monies realized from the sales of the Ford dealership and the small farm she had lived on since 1903. There were still a few debts left, and it bothered her to no end. She also decided to sell this farm to the owners of the Ford dealership, James Kay and Fred Graisley, but retain the doubtful privilege of renting this house back from them on a monthly basis. Of course, when the Depression hit, it was no longer possible to pay taxes or mortgage payments to Mother, and consequently, she paid no rent. Jim and Fred were most considerate and sympathetic to Mother's plight, so they installed an inside bathroom, complete with tub and toilet, 100-gallon overhead tank, and hand pump to keep the tank full of water. This allowed Mother to rent the front 4 rooms on a nightly basis to the tourist trade. The price was $1 each, or $1.25 with breakfast, which was served on our big dining room table and as close to a banquet as possible. End of Chapter 2 and completion of book.